Afternoon. It's great to be back again with you all. Appreciate the attendance here and everyone for sticking around. You know, it's so uplifting to be a part of this for even myself, and it's kind of selfish for me to be able to be a part of this and gain so much from it. We appreciate the opportunity to hear so many great speakers. You know, sometimes we kind of talk about midweek Bible study like it's a recharge of the batteries. Well, if that's the case, this is like being hit with a lightning bolt, because here, you know, it's really a lot. It's jam-packed, and so we are so appreciative of everyone who has done such a tremendous job. I'm thankful to be a part of it. Go ahead and be opening up your Bibles once again to Hebrews chapter 12. And I say once again because I'm blessed to be one of the few that gets the same text both times. And so I don't know how that worked out. I guess I knew I'd need two different sessions to cover the material, but that's okay. And so we're going to go through Hebrews chapter 12 once again today, looking at it from a different perspective. Now, I will say the hospitality we've had here from this congregation has been overwhelming. We've appreciated that, and I know I have. You all have been so welcoming. I will say I had several people tell me, they said, Hank, you know, you're the only thing that stands between us and a barbecue dinner. And so I appreciate the hospitality, but I think there was a little bit of a threat there. So we're going to do the best we can. So reacting properly to chastening. Now, yesterday we had the opportunity, we all went through Hebrews chapter 12, and we introduced the idea and the concept of chastisement, what it meant, the purpose behind it, and how it has an instructive purpose, that even sorrows, even suffering can have an instructive purpose for us. And so, as we get to look at the text again today, we're not left wondering, okay, how do we go through this? How do we go through the sufferings? How do we go through the sorrows and the trials of life? Because within the text, it will tell us. I remember hearing, and this is a very old quote, it's been attributed to JFK a few times, but it goes much further back than that. The earliest I could find was somewhere in the 15th or 16th century, coming from France, actually. But the quote has been translated to say something like this: "Do not pray for easy lives, pray to be stronger men." And that's something I think we all need to consider today, in that we need to be stronger. We need to be able to handle the trials of life. And so the last time we discussed this, as you have your Bibles open, we discussed the concept of chastisement, how God chastens sinners, why He does so. And, you know, I'm going to reiterate it again because I think it's important we realize that this concept is very foreign to the idea of the world today and the idea of how the world views God. Because many people view God and view religion, and I'm going to say Christianity very loosely here, Christendom across the world, as God is just this figure. All He does is shower down blessings, that life is just nothing but goodness and happiness and bliss. Friends, I want you to remember a text with me, and I don't think it's any coincidence that Hebrews 11 and 12 go right hand in hand together. Go back to Hebrews chapter 11 with me real quick, and let's just examine some of those examples we have of old. Now, we could read the whole chapter of Hebrews 11, but what I want you to key in on is just starting in verse number 32 with me of Hebrews chapter 11. It says, "And what shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, and of Barak, and of Samson, and of Jephthah, of David also, and Samuel, and of the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect." Now we consider chapter 12, verse number 1. "Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. Stopping at the end of verse number 2. Friends, a lot of times we pray for easy lives. We pray for an easy going. Think back to those examples we just went through. And how many of those believers, even of old, even in the first century church, how many of them just had blissful and easy lives? You think about and consider what they went through, all for that hope of that promise. You know, that verse really sticks out to me in verse number 38, of whom the world was not worthy. It was not worthy of men and women of such faith. And so we today have to realize that trials and sufferings and sorrows are not a fairy tale. That they're not something that just might happen to us. You know, we talked about that word yesterday, yet, there in verse number 4, that those Hebrews had not yet resisted unto blood. But it's something that was inevitable for them. They were being persecuted, but still there were those who had resisted unto death, resisted unto blood. And so, as we examine this, we've got to be prepared. Okay, I know chastening is a real thing. I know chastisement and sufferings and sorrows and trials. I know those are real things. Now, how do I deal with it? Well, the Hebrew writer tells us as we examine the text here today. Now, let's go ahead again and define our words, because I think it's important, once again, we make sure we have all of our definitions down. What does chastening mean? Well, remember, if you want to go over to Thayer's definition, if you go back to Thayer's, chastening, according to Thayer, means, quote, the whole training and education of children, whatever in adults also cultivates the soul, especially by correcting mistakes and curbing the passions, hence an instruction which aims at the increase of virtue. One thing we can add to that is we examine chastening and examine the word that it is. We can a lot of times liken it to correction. And it's done with correction, with instruction in mind. It's done to instruct us. It is not meant just for the sake of punishment, but it's done to instruct us. As remember, the ultimate conclusion we met yesterday as we examined all of this suffering to remind us to not fall into the pit, so that we would realize this world is not my home. That this world is not something that I should just thrive in and be content with, but I am going to a better place. And it instructs me with all of these things to realize that, and to realize how important it is that we share the gospel with others, that we make sure they know the truth. And so I'll add one thing to that. I think overall you can say it is the teaching and the training of someone, having clear expectations of them, and then carrying out corrective measures when they are not doing something right. And so chastening is something that is useful to us. Well, I think that covers a little bit of what we dealt with yesterday. But let's go ahead and understand today as we go through the text. Now that I know it's coming, how can I react properly to it? How can I understand what to do in the midst of this chastening, in the midst of these trials and sufferings, and all of these things that come our way? Well, let's begin by looking at verses 3 and 4. Hebrews chapter 12. First, who must we consider? You remember back there in verse number 2, and then I'll read verses 3 and 4 again. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. Ye have not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin. Now remember, as we stop at the end of verse number 4, we're dealing with the importance of running that race and of finishing that race. And it's preparing us for the expectation that, look, chastening's going to come our way. And so whenever these things happen to us, who do we first look to? Well, you remember verses 2 and 3. First and foremost, we must consider Jesus. Can you think of any better example of endurance? Of one who went to the race, fought the battle, and finished it? And so as we examine our lives, let's examine Christ. What did Jesus endure? If you just examine not only the persecution that he received from whether it was the Pharisees or the religious leaders or whoever it was, consider just a moment the cross. If you read back there in verse number 2, that's what it's talking about. Verse 2, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. You know, one thing we have to have in our mind is endurance. And so Jesus endured. He endured the cross. He endured not only the injustice of it, He endured the pain of it, the abandonment of the cross. And so as we examine and understand suffering and trials, the first thing we ever look to is Jesus Christ. That is our premier example. And as you see there, I think it's very interesting. It says, despising the shame. He did not accept the shame of what He was experiencing. Instead of despising the hand of God at work, which a lot of times we do, He despised and rejected. He refused to be affected by the shame of the ordeal He was going through. And so here we have the ultimate example of endurance with Christ. One of the aspects of Christ that fascinates me and terrifies me with the man Christ is the fact that He went through it knowing it would happen. You think about that for a second. You know, it's bad enough to go through something that hits you out of nowhere. You know, one of the worst things in dealing with situations that are just horrible and suffering and sorrow, and I don't know in our life, I doubt we'll ever near anything close to the cross. But whenever you know something's going to happen to you, and what does He do? He goes anyways. You remember back in John chapter 18 and verse number 11, as Jesus is telling Peter, remember what He said? Then said Jesus unto Peter, put up thy sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? Here Jesus endures the cross, having the foreknowledge that He would have to go to it. And so, as we look at our examples, okay, how do we react properly to it? The Hebrew writer says, remember Jesus and look to Him first. You remember Peter in the day of Pentecost, the first gospel sermon over there in Acts chapter 2. He says in verses 22 and 23 of Acts chapter 2, ye men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man approved of God among you by miracles and wonders and signs, which God did by Him in the midst of you, as ye yourselves also know. Him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, ye have taken, and by wicked hands have crucified and slain. This was the plan, and He went anyways. As we consider what endurance is, our journey must begin with the focus on Christ. What did He do in the worst times? He looked to God. He looked, and as you look back there in verse number 2, what happened to Him as a result of that? And is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. And so in verses 3 and 4, we're instructed today, we're to look to Christ. And so secondly, looking at verse number 5 of Hebrews chapter 12, we must not despise it. That's not an easy thing to do, is it? You remember verse number 5, and ye have forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as unto children. My son, despise not thou the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of Him. And so we must not despise it. But really, you look at how people usually undergo sufferings and undergo trials. It's one thing, and it's really interesting how people react whenever they go through something like this. You know, last time we talked about this yesterday, we used the example of the knife being made, of the blade being made. And here it is, as it's going through the hardening process, based upon the character and makeup of it, and as it goes through the process of being heated up and then cooled off, and as you go through that to make it hardened, the character and the makeup of it determine whether or not it breaks or it doesn't break. It's all based upon the character of it. What happens during that hardening process? What was it made of before? You know, I really believe you don't know who you are till you've gone through something like chastening. Truthfully, the inner person is revealed when the pressure is put on. And so whenever we look at it, whenever we look at our lives, and as we go through the pressure reveals who we really are. And we're not to despise it. We're not to despise it. Now that's something that's hard to comprehend, usually because it's painful or it's hard, or maybe it's discouraging. It's not something that we look forward to. It's the majority of people, they don't accept it. Now how easy is it, and how easy would it be if we lived the life of a Christian and there was never any heartache? There was never any suffering. But as remember we read back there a second ago in Hebrews 11, that great cloud of witnesses, that witnesses to us today, that speak to us today, they lived a life of persecution, of suffering, of chastisement. They lived a life of that because God is worthy of that. And so we're not to despise it. If you remember back in Proverbs chapter 1, and we examine verses 23 down through verse number 30, read this, Proverbs 1, 23 through verse number 30. Turn you at my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit unto you. I will make known my words unto you, because I have called, and ye refused. I have stretched out my hand, and no man regarded. But ye have set at naught all my counsel, and would none of my reproof. I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your fear cometh. When your fear cometh as desolation, and your destruction cometh as a whirlwind, when distress and anguish cometh upon you, then shall they call upon me, but I will not answer. They shall seek me early, but they shall not find. For that they hated knowledge, and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would none of my counsel. They despised all my reproof. We should never consider the chastening of the Lord as something that doesn't have any value. We can learn from it. And that's the whole purpose of it. Remember, that's what we talked about yesterday. It is instructive. But sadly, too many have the idea today, and we live in the prosperity preaching age. It's nothing new. It's just been packaged differently. It's been around. But as we examine the age that we're in, where it's just showering down blessings, and you consider even disciplining children, and people say, oh, you can't do that. You can't do that. Well, parents, why do you discipline your children? And let's say for the right reason, because there's some parents out there that shouldn't be parents. Let's get that out of the way. But for the parents that are good parents, why do you discipline your children? You do it because you love them, and you don't want them to fall into the pit, as remember we found in Job chapter 33. So it's ultimately for their good. And so God, through His love, chastens us. So we're not to despise it. That's why in verses 5 and 6, we're to expect it. Not only are we not to despise it, we're to expect it coming. Look at verses 5 and 6 together. And ye have forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as unto children. My son, despise not thou the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of Him. For whom the Lord loveth He chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom He receiveth. Everyone in God's family is going to experience chastening and suffering and troubles. You remember back to what Jesus says as He's preparing those apostles in John chapter 15, verses 18 through 20. John 15, 18 through 20. If the world hates you, ye know that it hated me before it hated you. If ye were of the world would love his own. But because ye are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you. Remember the word that I said unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord. If they have persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they have kept my saying, they will keep yours also. You know, Jesus is preparing them that they're going to face persecution. And here's a thought for us all to consider. And this is just as much for me as it is for you. If we're not being persecuted, are we standing up for the truth? Are we standing up and speaking out about the truth? Do others know that we're Christians? Or do we blend in? Even Peter said in 1 Peter 4 and verse number 12, Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened unto you. Don't think it's strange. If we're standing for the truth, that's going to happen. Even Paul says in 2 Timothy 3 and verse number 12, you remember this, Yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. And so for not being persecuted, maybe we need to look at ourselves. Because if we are speaking the truth, and if we are standing up for it, we're going to be a target of the world. It's going to happen. And so we're to expect it. Because we who live godly in this world, guess what? You and I are offensive to this world. They find you and me offensive. And so persecution is going to come because we are different. And we ought to be different. But we are told in verse number 5, when chastening comes our way, not only are we not to despise it or expect it, we're told don't faint. That's just a way, don't quit. Remember, this is all talking about that race back there in chapter 12, verse number 1, dealing with endurance and running that race. And if you're running a race and you fall or you faint, what happens? Well, you lose. That's the worst thing that can happen in a race, if you faint. And so we're told, don't faint. Verse 5, And ye have forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as unto children. My son, despise not thou the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. Imagine quitting on God. Running, maybe it's from guilt, running from the truth, running from the Word. You know, fainting, in the Bible word fainting is the result of quitting. The idea of quitting the race. And so whenever we read these things or whenever we undergo chastening or suffering, we're told don't quit. Don't faint. And ultimately, who do we look back to? Who didn't faint? We consider Jesus. Because Jesus didn't quit. And so whenever we are troubled on every side, you remember Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 8 and 9? He says, we are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Cast down, but not destroyed. So even if it's on every side, don't quit. If you skip ahead a few chapters into 2 Corinthians chapter 12, remember verses 7 through 10? Paul says, unless I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, and persecutions, and distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. Interesting concept, isn't it? To be weak is to be strong. It means I'm not relying on myself. Because if I was, I would faint. I'm relying on Christ. And when I do that, when I find weakness in self, when I rely on the Word, then I'm made strong. But I'm going to faint if I don't rely on that. And so Ephesians 6 and verse number 13 makes it very plain to us how we ought to act in the midst of persecution. It says, wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. You get that? To stand. Where are the men and women who are supposed to be standing up in this wicked world? Where are we whenever it comes to the abortion, to homosexuality, to transgenderism, to all of these things? Are we standing against those? Or is it easier to go over here and hide under the pulpit under a corner? You know, it's not going to get easy, and it's not supposed to. As Christians, we're going to be awed. I read a very interesting study. I remember hearing this in college. They were doing a study on which habits were the most addicting. It was very interesting because the first one wasn't what I expected. You know, you think about maybe drugs and alcohol or even pornography, and all those things were way up there. But the number one habit that is so addicting is quitting. Quitters quit. Are you a quitter? Quitting is actually the most addictive habit there is. And so if we have the attitude of a quitter, that I'm going to quit whenever there gets a little bit of pushback, whenever it gets tough, I'm going to faint. Do not pray for easy lives. Pray to be stronger men. You see, we are to not faint. Don't quit. And ultimately, as these things begin to culminate, look at verse number 6 of Hebrews 12. We're told to accept it. Not expect it, as we read earlier, accept it. Verse 6, for whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. So receive chastening that is allowed by God. And we looked at Job a lot yesterday. And I'll use a passage from there that we didn't touch on yesterday. And I think it's important we talk about it today when dealing with reacting properly to it. Remember Job chapter 2 and verse number 10. Now we talked about verse number 9 of chapter 2, where his wife was talking about, well, why are you still holding up? Curse God and die. And you know what Job says in verse 10? But he said unto her, thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. What? Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? And all this did not Job sin with his lips. You know, you and I, and all the troubles that we face, and all the things that we go through, we've got to accept chastening. We've got to accept that I am not above it. I'm going to say something, brethren, and this is just as much for me as it is for you. Some Christians think way too highly of themselves. We think, and I think, and perhaps you think sometimes that we're above that. That we're above it, we're better than that. I don't need it. You kidding me? Friends, we must accept it. And so let's stop stiffening up and fighting against it and accept it and be instructed and learn. Because that's what we're ultimately supposed to do, is to grow. It's such an interesting truth, but it's so illogical the way the world looks at it. But you know, the way to speeding up spiritual growth is to accept correction. Look at an interesting passage with me. Go back to Proverbs chapter 9, verse number 8. I want you to look at this with me. Proverbs chapter 9, verse number 8. I want you to get there and look at this with me. Proverbs 9, verse number 8 says, "Reprove not a scorner, lest he hate thee. Rebuke a wise man, and he will love thee." That sounds like an illogical truth, isn't it? But truthfully, the pain of knowing my flaws always outweighs the pain of not knowing them. And so, when I'm going through these times and these trials, it exposes where I'm weak. So imagine if you suspect you've got a leaking boat. Maybe that's one way to look at it. Well, how do you test if it's leaking? Well, you got to put it in water. You got to undergo a trial with it to make sure and see where it's leaking so you can fix it. And so let's accept it and learn where we can grow. Look at verse number 7 of Hebrews chapter 12. We are to endure. You know, endurance is a main theme that runs through this chapter. Endurance. Verse number 7 of Hebrews 12. "If ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not?" Endurance. To put up with it every day if you have to, but to endure. It is our training. To go against our old nature, that's training, and that takes endurance. And you think about when it says to not be weary, to not lose heart, the idea of enduring that chastening. How important is endurance in every other aspect of life? You think about it in sports. If you don't have endurance, you're not going to stay in the match. Those of you who've been married for a while, does it take endurance? See, yes. Yes, it does. Because it's not an easy thing. It takes endurance. It takes work. I've been married 4 years. It takes work. It takes endurance. Now, some of you tell me later on, but I tell you right now, it takes endurance. In business, does it take endurance? It takes endurance to go through the hard times, doesn't it? You know, in the military, whenever they test pilots to make sure they're capable of handling G's, the G-force, what do? They run them through the G-force machine and they test them and they train them so that they can endure it. Go back a couple chapters in Hebrews chapter 10, verse number 36. It says, "For ye have need of patience, that after ye have done the will of God, ye might receive the promise." Endurance is important in every walk of life, and it is so important in our Christian lives. We have to have it to endure. We have to have it, and that means even in the hard times, because that is training us and preparing us. Let's learn that instruction. Let's learn where we can grow. Let's learn where we're leaking so we can know where to fix it. Ours is not to be a life of just blessing and of ease and all of these things. We are to endure. Ours is a life of endurance. You remember in Mark chapter 4, verse number 17? In Mark 4, verse number 17, it says, "And have no root in themselves, and so endure but for a time. Afterward, when affliction or persecution ariseth for the word's sake, immediately they are offended." The truth is, some, and most even, maybe they endure for a little while. They endure until what happens? Until it gets hard. Until there's pressure. And we cannot be those people. While undergoing this chastening, the Hebrew writer tells us, as we examine 7 and 8 together, it says, "If ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? But if ye be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then are ye illegitimate and not sons." Now in this, we are to examine ourselves. And this is the question I ask myself and you today. As we look in the mirror, who are you when times get hard? Because that's the real you. The person under pressure, that's the real us. What are we whenever things are under pressure and they're not going our way? Do we get angry? Do we mouth off maybe? Our tongues speak up? Maybe we're envious. Maybe we're bitter. Whatever it is for you, whenever things get hard, who are we? And where is our faith? And so we are to examine ourselves. It is hot water that reveals what's on the inside. It is the hardening process of the blade that determines whether it is actually hardened and has the character to withstand it. And so who are you and I when things get hot, when things are really turned up? Who are you and I? We are to examine ourselves. And that goes with our next one, to grow. You see, the Hebrew writer is not leaving us wondering what we're to do when chastening comes our way. We are to learn from it. And that comes from examining ourselves. They go hand in hand. We've got to learn from it. And that means grow. And sometimes that means, and maybe a lot of times, means to change. Look at verse number 10 of Hebrews 12. For they verily for a few days chastened us after their own pleasure, but He for our profit, that we might be partakers of His holiness. Now once again, the purpose of this is change. A very interesting test case here to look at. Go back to the gospel account of Luke with me. Luke chapter 22. And let's just look at an example of this. Luke chapter 22. And look at verses 31 and 32 with me. Luke 22, 31 and 32. So here, remember, Jesus is speaking to Peter, and he's warning him that Satan would rather tear him apart than see him whole. He's warning him that this is going to happen. Look at Luke 22, 31 and 32. And the Lord said, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan hath desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for thee that thy faith fail not. And when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren. Well, what does Jesus do? Here Peter is. He's about to undergo a trial. What does he do? Does he take it away from him? No, he doesn't. He prays for him, but he did not say he's going to take away Satan's attack. And so Peter ultimately would be stronger in the end. And that's why, you go and examine verse number 32. After going through that, and then he's able to strengthen his other believers, other brethren that are with him. But this is a result from these trials. Suffering and trials and moments like these reveal who you and I are. And they reveal where we need work. And they reveal what we need to do to fix them if we'll simply look at the Word and read it for ourselves. The Hebrew writer is not leaving us wondering here. And so the next thing in verses 12 and 13, we're not to do it alone either. Verses 12 and 13 says, Wherefore lift up the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet, lest that which is lame be turned out of the way, but let it rather be healed. The idea of lifting up others' drooping hands. Brethren, we're to help each other. In these moments of suffering and trials, what a beautiful thing it is and what a blessing it is to have a family to rely on. Are we the brethren we ought to be when others are facing struggles? You remember Job's friends. What did he say in Job 16, verse number 2? Now, I will say this. We can learn something from Job's friends. We can. If we'll just look at the first part of it. Because remember, here Job is, and he's suffering. And he's had this horrible ordeal. He's lost his children. He's lost his wealth. He's lost his health. And his friends come by, and what do? They stay with him 7 days or more. Nobody says a word. And when did the problem start? When they open their mouth. When we have brothers or sisters who are mourning or who are struggling, your presence matters more than what you think you can say. Because there's nothing you can say to a grieving spouse or a grieving parent that's going to matter in the end. There's not a fancy phrase you can say. Be there for them and be with each other as we go through these. We don't have to do chastening alone, and isn't that a beautiful thing? Isn't that a wonderful thing to be able to rely on brothers and sisters to help each other through these afflictions and sufferings, that we can help one another? Job says of his friends in Job 16 and verse number 2, I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are ye all. Let's not be Job's friends. And so ultimately, verses 14 and 15, culminating it all in together, follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord, looking diligently lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. So stop at the end of verse 15. Be at peace with how many men? All men, even the ones that are striving to hurt you. And we're told to be holy. And we talk about being holy, being godly. being like Christ through the suffering. Because ultimately, you'll notice a trend here, that all of these things we've discussed, as the Hebrew writer is telling us about how to endure it and how to react properly, they all point back to the first one, don't they? Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. And so, to be Christ-like, to be a Christian, to be a follower, we've got to do what Christ did. And what did He do? He endured. Are you thankful for trials and sorrows and suffering? Are you thankful for those because it makes us realize that all of those things point us to a place where we ought to be shooting for? You know, we ended yesterday with asking ourselves some very difficult questions. You've had a night to think on those questions. How did you answer them? Do you serve God for nothing? And that doesn't mean I don't serve Him for any end. That means I serve Him in sickness and in health. I serve Him when I'm at my peak and when I'm at my lowest. I serve Him whenever I've lost and when I've won. I serve Him always. And so we've got to be aware and beware of bitterness, because so many become bitter as a result of their trials. And so many turn and blame God. And so many hate God for these things that happen to them. Friends, these trials and these sufferings are done from a God that loves us enough to not allow us to fall into the pit, to allow us to realize that ultimately this world is not my home. And let's remember that to the very end. No matter what I'm facing, react properly to chastening. Now the real question is all of us examine ourselves. And you think about a moment in your life, and I want you to think about a hard moment in your life. I want you to think about a moment of suffering and trial, and how were you in that moment? Because the only time you're really revealed is when those moments happen. So how do we react to chastening? That really is the question, isn't it? How do we react to it? Are we one that's appreciative? Are we one that's thankful? Or are we one that becomes bitter? So friends, here's what we've learned. We've gone through Hebrews chapter 12. I beat Brother Chuck to it because he had the Hebrews here the other night, and he was almost getting there. He scared me. So we've learned a great deal of things. We've learned what the word chastening means. We've learned that every Christian needs chastening, instruction in their lives. We've learned how God chastens us. We've learned the purpose behind it. But ultimately, we take from this lesson this, and I hope most importantly you take from it this, that in the midst of suffering, in the midst of trials, we consider Jesus. We consider Jesus, the one who endured it all, even knowing it would happen for you and I. No, the Hebrew writer doesn't leave us alone with how we are to go through it. He instructs us how. The question we all ask ourselves today, how do we react to chastening? What person are you when the heat is turned up? Let us remember verse number 2 of Hebrews 12. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. My friend, who are you today? Thank you all so much for your attention and your time.